Nelson Mandela's incarceration meant he never got to see his grandchildren grow up. His eldest grandson, Mandla, was born while Mandela was in jail. Today in NP, Mandela says, the chief Mvezo, that there's a new generation that can learn from the country's struggle heroes. Lindsay Dentlinger spoke to him.
Growing up in the dusty streets of Soweto, I used to hear young people shouting, "Viva Mandela, viva!" And it was very profound to me because there I was being a young kid holding this surname and I didn't even know what it meant. And the more they said "Viva Mandela," I slotted myself in there thinking that they were shouting my name. But most importantly was that they would say Mandla. Now you have one name Mandla and the other Mandela in the same crowd. I thought I was very important.
Mandela first met his grandfather as a 9-year-old in 1983, a decision taken by his late father, Makgato. He was taken to Pollsmoor prison by his grandfather's second wife, Winnie, and struggle stalwarts, Dola and Farida Omar.
Just the size of the building and the bars on every window, the bars on every door, clearly spelled out we're in a prison, and I started having hundreds of questions running in my head as to why were we in a prison. The giant came in, he turned around to me and said, "You must be my grandson." And if he's my grandfather, it means, you know, for a 9-year-old, prison is for people that have done wrong in society. And I became very angry about it, very bitter, and even the conversations we had subsequent to that became one-worded kind of responses. But Madiba could see all of this, you know. With the wisdom in him, he understood exactly what I was experiencing, what I was going through.
After that visit, Mandela wrote to his friend, Helen Joseph.
She makes me read this letter, says, "What do you make of this letter?" I say, "Oh, bit embarrassed, thinking, you know, Madiba thought I was very backward." Says, "No, this is an encoded letter from your grandfather. He says that you came to see him, you had no knowledge of who he is in terms of the ideals he stands for and the principles that he stands for, and his commitment to our struggle for liberation. He's asked me to educate you and tutor you through this." And this was very profound to me because here was Madiba reaching out to a white woman who was a dear friend and comrade of his. And in my own growing up, white people were a representation of oppression and brutality.
Subsequent to his first visit, Mandla visited his grandfather at least once a year, sometimes twice if permission was granted.
Madiba longed to have the interaction and the engagement with his children, and having been denied that, he somewhat compensated it with the grandchildren. He wanted to see us regularly. He wanted to understand what were we doing in terms of our education. He always placed education in the center of everything that we did.
In 1986, he arranged for Mandla to school in Swaziland. He recalls his grandfather always being inquisitive about his schooling and the subjects he enjoyed.
The visits really became a grandchild to a grandfather visit. And I enjoyed every moment of those engagements. I remember sitting at school receiving soccer boots. The first pair of soccer boots I ever received were not even from my mother or my father, but from my grandfather, Patrick Ewing's. And I thought to myself, here a pair of soccer boots coming from my grandfather, and I treasured these soccer boots. But he was very loving to his family, always wanting the best for us, and including on his last years, which he spent at Victor Verster prison. I was invited with my cousin sister Nandi, and we came and spent a weekend with him there prior to his release.
Mandela would later replicate the cottage at Drakenstein Correctional Centre in Krunu in the Eastern Cape, where he grew up.
Madiba wanted to take back home. One of his testing experiences through his entire incarceration was on Victor Verster prison, because at some point he was isolated from the comrades that he had been with on Robben Island for 18 years and on Pollsmoor for another 5 years. And this last few years, he had to engage with a regime that no one thought could ever be persuaded or convinced otherwise. And it tested his ability of leadership, his ability of being a good negotiator. And he consulted respectively with his colleagues and comrades of the Rivonia trialists, but also he always told us in this process he received a letter from the then President Oliver Tambo, who was in exile in Zambia, saying, "What exactly are you doing with the regime? What do you hope to achieve? As an individual, you'll be totally compromised." And he thought to himself, to engage OR in this kind of dialogue will be fruitless. So he wrote a very simple short letter, "I'm just talking."
Mandla was at school in Swaziland when Mandela was released from prison on the 2nd of February 1990. His friends summoned him to the common room to watch the scenes on television.
Greeting the people outside the fences of the Victor Verster prison.
I stopped thinking or reasoning on that particular moment. I left boarding school and hitchhiked my way all the way back to Soweto. Even the truck driver was in disbelief when I got into his truck at Oshuk Ngwenya border gate. And so he says, "Who are you?" So I explained who I am. He says, "Oh no, man, rubbish. Everyone is going to be claiming to be related to the great man." And I had to convince this man that, no, I am Madiba's grandson. And he says, "So who's your mother?" And with his understanding, Madiba had 2 daughters, and Zenani and Zinzi. I said, "No, I'm born by Madiba's second son." He says, "Nonsense, Madiba has never had a son." And it became an interesting adventure coming back home. Here I was trying to explain to this man that Madiba had a first wife called Evelyn Ntogomase, and with her he had 4 kids. One of those kids is my father, Mandela, and he was in disbelief of this. But by the time we got to Boksburg and I was stepping out because that's where he was finally going, he says, "How are you now going to town and to Soweto?" Same way as I got here, I will hitchhike. And then he says, "Man, in case you are indeed Madiba's grandson, here's some money for you to get to town and to get home. I wouldn't want to be the person that left you on the side of the road." And I think, I always wonder what became of him after that. But should he still be out there, I continue to say I hope our paths will cross and I'll be able to thank him for bringing me back home and for enabling me to meet my grandfather as a free man.
Finally leaving the Victor Verster prison, his own for the last 14 months.
Lindsay Dentlinger, Cape Town.